Our class today is titled The Rise of Islam. But in our search for the reactive church, this one takes a little bit more explanation, perhaps, than the others, because the rise of Islam is something that lasted for 300 or 400 years. And so there were many different ways the church reacted. But before we can get into the rise of Islam per se, let me do a little background on what the world was like before Islam, and particularly what the Christian world was like before Islam. Most of us, as we study church history, we sort of gloss over this because it is a sad fact that the Western church has often seen itself as the church. But as we saw last week, the East and the West were divided, and so that separated the West. And today in our class, we're going to see how the North and the South are divided. And so there's even more reason why the Western church always just focused in on itself. And in our Christian education, we often don't realize that there was a time before Islam when Christianity was a dominant religion all the way from the British Isles all the way through to Persia. All of North Africa, down into Egypt, and all the way into Ethiopia. It had not yet arrived in Northern Europe. It had not yet spilled over into the Russias and into the Central Asian plains. But there were missionaries from a long forgotten group called the Nestorian Christians, which were active in Central Asia along the Silk Route, spreading Christianity even into the Far East. It's nice to remind you all and to remind ourselves that when Marco Polo arrived at the court of the Kublai Khan, he found Nestorian Christian missionaries already there. So Christianity was a world religion, much more than just a Western European religion. But with the rise of Islam, this ends in all practical purposes. And so the action of the rise of Islam, it's complicated. The widespread nature of the church, though, was only possible because there had been a period of tremendous stability brought on by the Roman civil order. Even when the Roman Empire started to collapse, as we talked about last week, there was an orderliness, and the church filled the vacuum, as I said then. And everywhere the Roman Empire had been, there was still a sort of a semblance of Roman civil authority. There was the Pax Romana. And even into the Mesopotamia and into what's now Turkey and all through North Africa, this had been Roman area. So there was church structure and there was civil structure. They may have eventually broken down into various kingdoms and various nation states, but there was not a huge attempt by one group to conquer others, and the church was able to survive, being sort of the power structure of the world in that place, but not necessarily doing it in a defensive way. There is a time in the early Middle Ages where all this changes, and the church, which had originally not even allowed soldiers to become Christians, turns into a religion with warrior monks. And this process is one of the things we want to talk about today. The reaction of the church to Islam, I'm going to talk about 4 different kinds of reactions. But before I get into those reactions, let's just review how the rise of Islam began. And the world it began into was the Arabian Peninsula, where the Prophet Muhammad lived, and he is said to have received his first revelation, which would result in Islam, in the year 610. So all of this is going to take place in the 7th century, so that helps you place it. In the 610, but it was a slow process. His first revelation in 610 But the Hagira, the great starting point of Islam in some reckoning, is 622. So there were 12 years where he's developing the revelations, and the Quran is coming into being. It wasn't easily accepted. The Arabian Peninsula was not a single kingdom. It was a great mosaic of nations, mostly merchant cities, merchant states, each defending their place, not particularly united. And they were both Christian, Jewish, and Persian type religions, Egyptian, I mean, you name it, there was an area that was wide open to religious diversity. But when Islam attempted to enter into the town of Medina first, there was a great battle fought. There was arguments and fights. The people did not change easily to Islam, and there was a period from 624 to 628 where there was just constant war, as everywhere the Muslim followers went, they were met with armed conflict. In 630, the Muslim forces finally got enough strength that the city of Mecca succumbed and surrendered. And so there is now an establishment of Islam as an official religion of a place. But it was only 2 years later, in 632, that Muhammad himself died. So it seems like a rather slow start, but it's a start that's backed up with force and weapons and swords. It's a religion that is not being spread by the philosophical conversion of willing people, but it's often a religion that's being spread by who is the strongest, who is the fastest, who is the mightiest. We can see this in effect because Muhammad dies 632. By 637, Mesopotamia has already been conquered. And also in the year 637, the Byzantine Empire of Constantinople loses several major battles to the Muslim armies, and they lose the Levant, which I guess would be Syria, Lebanon, southern Turkey. In only 100 years after that, the Muslim armies have completely conquered all of North Africa and up into Spain, and the Caliphate of Cordoba in Spain is established in 756. So it got a slower start in Arabia, but a faster spread throughout the rest of the world. By the time Islam had finished its maximum expansion, it had gotten all the way to India and down into Indonesia, all through the central steppes of Asia, across to North Africa, all of the Spanish Peninsula, and in fact, they would have very likely continued further up into France were it not for the first of the reactions of the church that I will talk about, and that is the reaction of we must defend ourselves. And the great defense in France was the famous Battle of Roncesvalles, if I say that right. And it's known to us primarily because the oldest piece of literature in French is the Song of Roland. And this is the great epic which tells about the Battle of Roncesvalles and about how Roland rose up and led the armies of Charlemagne to defeat the Islamic invaders coming across the Pyrenees. And the Muslim armies retreated back into what we now call Spain. The defense was an ongoing thing because the Islamic forces did not give up easily on trying to conquer Europe. Every Italian city you go to, you can see the churches are all built like fortresses when they are along the ocean front. And you read into everything, the cities were destroyed constantly by Muslim marauders and pirates and armies trying to come across. Malta and Sicily and southern Italy were controlled by Muslim forces from time to time, and there was constant battle and skirmishing around the edges. it wasn't an easy thing to try to protect Europe, because the coastlines were so vast and the armies of Islam were so adamant. But the Muslim forces never really gained a greater and a lasting foothold, except in Spain, where we know their caliphate list lasted from 756 all the way to the time of Isabel and Ferdinand in the 1490s, when finally Cordoba and the Alhambra finally surrendered. There's another famous poem too, if you like ancient literature, another poem about a great European hero who fights the Muslim hordes, and that is this other Spanish, maybe Portuguese, the poem of El Cid. I only know it because of Charlton Heston's movie called El Cid, but it's also an ancient early medieval poem, epic poem of 4,000 lines or something like that. The defensive actions were hard for the church, because the church had not up to that time had an army. It was a defensive action mostly done by political entities of the more secular sort, like Charlemagne's army or a king's army. It was not a church's army, though most of the people in those nations and in the army were Christians. It wasn't controlled in any way by the church. The second reaction that I would like to talk about is how the church realized that if they're going to survive, they might well lose land and lose people, but maybe the expansion of Christendom is to be taken on. And so we find in the same time, in the 7th and 8th, 9th centuries, we see not only an expansion of Islam, but a great expansion of Christianity as well. If the enemies of Christ, so to speak, were going to be militant, then the proponents of Christ needed to be, equally militant in their missionary work. Not militant militarily, but we see during this time the great expansion of missionaries into Northern Europe and into Russia. I like to remember a saint that he's not really well known in Anglicanism, but he was the first Archbishop of Copenhagen. Do any of you know who I'm talking about? In his Latinized form, he's called Saint Ansgarius, but in the Danish, it's Saint Ansgar. It's a very Viking-sounding name, Ansgar. He was made Archbishop of Copenhagen before there was a Christian in Copenhagen. He was sent by the church authorities further south to go up and to convert the Vikings, who were also causing a lot of trouble at that time. And Saint Ansgar is a notable story. I'll just tell you just one little paragraph about him. He only succeeded after his death. The whole time, his whole life there in Copenhagen, he failed to convert anyone. He set up soup kitchens. He set up missionary works, hospitals. He took care of the widows and the orphans. He did all the compassionate works of Christ, and he built a church where he would preach, but no one ever got baptized. He died feeling he had failed in every possible way. But it was his absence that convinced the people of how important he had become to them and how important his God had become to them. And after his death, that's when the baptism started coming, as people said, we miss having this Christian influence in our city. And so Ansgar is an example of, for a lot of priests who fail, like everything they've done is failure. And but sometimes in God's timing, things work out in a way that he was not present to hear about. But he's an interesting character, and you can Google him if you like. The other great story of expansion is, of course, the story of how the Russias came to be converted. And that was a very important block against Muslim expansion. And it goes back to take us back to Constantinople. And in these days, Russia wasn't Moscow. Russia was Kiev. The Ukraine, what we now think of as Ukraine, was the heartland of the Russias. They had actually been descendants, I think I'm correct in saying, descendants of Scandinavian migrants who came down looking for better land. And the Ukrainians have a cultural heritage with the Vikings themselves. But by the time that Christianity gets to Kiev, they have given up more of their Viking lifestyle and adopted something that's a more agrarian. And anyway, the leader of the Kievan Rus is trying to decide whether they should align themselves with the Eastern Constantinople Byzantine Christians, or whether they should go with the Western Roman Catholic Christians. And the story is that he sent ambassadors to both places to see which one would work best for them. And the missionaries, the ambassadors from Rome came back and they said, it's all very well organized and there are laws and rules and regulations for everything. And we could do well to ally with them. But the ambassadors from Constantinople came back and they said, they took us into the big cathedral, meaning Hagia Sophia. They took us in, and as the liturgy began, we were transported into very heaven itself. The music echoing around, the clouds of incense, the flickering of the candles. I'm sure we were in heaven. And so the Kievan Rus decided to go with Constantinople. They said the power of the liturgy to transport them into the presence of God was going to be more important than having rules and regulations. So they became Orthodox. But as Islam was limited by the expansion of Christianity, this missionary work tied right into the defensive work. But it was always that the church was acting in ways to protect themselves against further Islamic expansion. A third reaction is the one that's the most famous probably, and that is the reaction when the church says, only do we need to defend our own turf, we need to retake the Holy Land. And this results in what we all call the Crusades. Retaking the Holy Land first started with retaking a right to travel to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. But then as the pilgrims went, and as caliphs and sultans changed, that some were more welcoming than others. And eventually there was just too much hostility between the pilgrims and the residents and the overlords. And it finally came in 1095 that Pope Urban calls for an army to come and reconquer Jerusalem so that pilgrims could always have free access. So the Crusades started. There were quite a few different Crusades called by different popes and different leaders. And we generally say 1095 to about 1270 is the period of the Crusades. Some were quite successful in conquering and building European-style castles in the Lebanon and in Judea and in Syria. And some Western Europeans even set up governments and governed as the kingdom of Damascus or the kingdom of Beirut or different places. I'm not giving you the real titles, but I mean, they set up what they thought were going to be lasting kingdoms, but they didn't last. And eventually they were driven out by the Islamic forces who retaliated over them. The idea was that these were not national armies like had been the army of Charlemagne. These were Christendom armies made up of multiple nationalities of adventurer soldiers with a religious inspiration. We sometimes use the word warrior monk. And there were some religious orders specifically set up to be militant army type religious orders, no longer following the Benedictine model of enclose yourself behind a wall and spend your life in prayer and works, but to get on horseback, get your chainmail, pick up your sword, and and fly off to the Middle East so that you could defend Christendom and hold the holy sites of Christ's life for the pilgrims. The most famous, perhaps, are the Knights of Malta. And that's a very interesting story to read about how they defended against overwhelming odds. But eventually the Ottomans drove them out of Rhodes, and they retreated to Malta, where again they made just absolutely heroic efforts to keep the Ottoman army and navy from expanding into the Western Mediterranean. I've done 2 different interims in Malta, and so I probably know too much about that that I don't want to say that that's all that was really important, but I do want to encourage you to look them up. There's also, of course, the Teutonic Knights, which are worth investigating too because of their German connection. And these warrior monk religious orders went and had monasteries built, and some were not necessarily of the friar mode. They were more of a monk mode, and there's a distinction. The friars were generally given to poverty, whereas not all monks were necessarily given to poverty. And a lot of these warrior monks were actually noblemen who took along an entourage and had their apartment set up in their monastery. And in Malta, they had, I think, 7 different, maybe 8 different national houses. They were all one religious order, but the French had their own auberge, and the Germans had an auberge. And the Bavarians, I believe, actually joined in with the English to make their auberge, and the Spanish had one. And so they were able to maintain their own identity, but they worked together as an army of religious foundation. The Teutonic Knights, of course, eventually, when they were no longer able to defend in the Holy Land, they actually ended up somehow ruling Poland. That's a whole nother story, how they became the kings of Poland. And so there was a great mixture of religion, politics, and warfare. This reconquering effort, the Crusades, was quite impactful. And in fact, we still feel the impact even into our own day, as there are such hostilities that continue in the bad feelings between the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews in the very unholy Holy Land. The fourth reaction of the church, I would think, is one that is maybe now finally coming to some kinds of fruition, and it's the reaction which I might call dialogue, where instead of fighting with the Muslims, maybe we can learn something from them, maybe we can talk to them, maybe we can find things that we agree on. Now, this is not something we see a lot of through the Middle Ages, but we do see it in ways of accidental dialogue. And one is that when the Crusaders went, they pillaged, they ransacked, and they brought an awful lot of stuff back with them to Western Europe. Not only the relics, which they used to inspire the building of great cathedrals. The best example maybe being Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, the most glorious and beautiful royal chapel there for the kings of France, where they were built it all around the crown of thorns. They thought they had received the actual crown of thorns and brought it back, and that was so inspiring to them that they built this gorgeous thing. The cathedral in Cologne has the relics of the 3 kings. And any of the great cathedrals you come to, they're going to all have their own claim to having some kind of a religious relic that was brought back. Now, I'm not saying that this is the example of dialogue, but along with the thorns and the pieces of the ark and the holy cloak and the spearhead and all these different things, that there's even one church that claims to have a vial of the Virgin Mary milk. How they got that and how they could believe that, I find difficult, but it is an example of how they brought everything back that the Arabs could sell to them. But they also brought back books and scrolls and writings. The Muslim scholars had protected and preserved great classical literature from the Greek and Roman period. The Egyptian libraries, when Egypt was conquered, suddenly those books started ending up in Spain. And one of the most important ones was a book that the Western world had thought was totally lost. And it was the writings of Aristotle. They had Plato. Western Church had a lot of Plato, but they knew of Aristotle because Plato talked about him, and other people had referenced him, but they didn't have very much actually written by Aristotle. But thanks to the Muslim scholars, these things came back into Western Europe, thus creating a kind of a dialogue where the East and the West could speak through the ancient philosophers. This finding of the book of Aristotle in Spain, Christy, you might have to help me with the name of that scholar. I think it was like Aroides or something like that starts with an A. And he was a Spanish scholar who translated the Aristotle into Latin. Does anyone know who I'm talking about? He's not famous in the famous sense of the word, but boy, is he important, because his translation then got into the hands of St. Thomas Aquinas.
It was Averroes.
Averroes, thank you very much, Ellen. I was close.
Yeah.
Thomas Aquinas then took Aristotle and was able, in his genius, to blend it with Plato, creating this scholasticism, which was very, very important in the development of the intellectual life of the West. But another example of dialogue was an actual face-to-face dialogue by a saint that you know of, but you may not have realized that he actually attempted a peaceful spoken dialogue with Islam, and this is Saint Francis of Assisi. Have any of you heard the story about how he and Brother Illuminati, one of his companions, joined on a boat from Italy full of crusaders who were going to attack Egypt, and they went along. Now imagine, here's the Il Poverello, the little poor one, with his humble homespun habit and patched and carrying no bag and no shoes, and just looking probably dirty and awful and poor. But anyway, they're going along with the troops. And when they get to Egypt, they land at Alexandria, but Francis and Illuminati cross the Crusader lines and immediately are arrested by the guards of the Sultan of Egypt, who think, well, they should treat them like they treat everybody else who have come across possible spies. Let's just kill them. But Francis had something about him that looked a little like an oddness, and they were afraid to kill him because they thought maybe he is mad. He's crazy. He's saying, take me to the Sultan. I have a message from God. And they didn't dare kill him because what if he's telling the truth? So anyway, Francis talked his way into the court of the Sultan of Egypt and was treated with respect as a religious figure, as a holy man. And he was able to tell his whole gospel version of why the Sultan should convert. He did not convert, and he returned Francis and Illuminati back to the safety of the Crusader lines. But it's an interesting story that is both fully in character and yet strangely not discussed very much. We always think of him preaching to the birds and converting the wolf of Gubbio and things like that. But his trip to see the Sultan of Egypt is one of the few examples that we could talk about where the Christian attempt was in a peaceful dialogue. If you go to YouTube, you can put in St. Francis and the Sultan, and they have several different clips that they show both from a historical point of view and also from the 1961 movie on St. Francis, which would be maybe interesting for you if you like saints. And Some of these stories may end up being a little bit more legendary than the historians among you might want to see, but anyway, it's worth knowing about. The reactions of the church were many. One was to defend what we already have. Two was to expand out into making more area for Christianity. Third was to try to reconquer the Holy Land and continue the allowance of pilgrimages. And eventually we got to the point where there are actually now dialogues that take place. We saw last week the Pope in Iraq sitting down with the head imam of the Shia sect. You know, these sorts of things for sadly 1,000 years would have been absolutely unthinkable. What we lack in this reaction of the Western Church is what did the rest of the Christian world do? And in Egypt, the Copts just kept calm and carried on, so to speak. They got a working relationship with the Muslim overlords, and they have continued active Christianity there since they were conquered. Sometimes it's by paying hefty taxes and by submitting in various ways. And even now they are regularly firebombed in their churches and attacked by Muslim militants, and yet the faith remains strong and remains very much alive there. If you go down to Ethiopia, they survived the Islamic things by saying, we don't have to go to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. That's what's causing the trouble. Why don't we build an ersatz Jerusalem right here in Ethiopia? And they built those magnificent underground churches carved out of solid stone. And they said, this new Jerusalem will be the same effect of grace and merit upon you who come here as any of you who try to go to the actual Jerusalem. And so in various places, Christianity survived, but almost unbeknownst to the Western Christian world, there wasn't a way that they could cross over the line of Islam to find the Christians on the other side. So this North Africa line through the Mesopotamia into Persia and into India, this sort of separated the northern Christians from what we might still think of as the southern Christians. And it wasn't really until the Ottoman Empire started allowing travel better, and maybe when the Europeans start venturing around to West Africa and finding the alternative route to the Spice Islands, that the West kind of comes back into an awareness that there are still Christians over there. And of course, they were immediately declared heretic because they were Monophysite, and the Pope condemned them all for not being properly obedient to the Vatican. And so, I mean, there's several more lectures that could be made out of this, but I think our time is almost up. And so I'm wondering if anybody has guessed by now, what is the music that would go along with the lecture on the rise of Islam and the development of militant warrior monks and in fact, Christian soldiers altogether? Ellen, what do you think it is?
Onward, Christian soldiers.
You are correct.
Yeah.
Can you hear the music? Let me just double check that I'm not turning it on in vain. Wave, shake your head if you just heard the fanfare. Okay. I'm finding the illustrations to be a little bit troubling, axe heads dripping with blood and soldiers falling. I've always liked the song, partly from Arthur Sullivan, of Gilbert Sullivan, who wrote the music, but also partly because I felt that it talks about spiritual warfare, and I'm not sure I want to see it as the war cry of the marauding armies of the Crusaders. But you can go back and listen to it further if you want to. Thank you so much for being part of our class today. Next week, we're going to talk about another very pleasant action in the history of the world, the Black Death.